All right. Hello, everyone. Paul, Derek, and I are honored to have Dr. Paul LeBlanc as our special guest tonight. Dr. LeBlanc is the president of Southern New Hampshire University and author of Students First, Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education, and most recently, Broken, How Our Social Systems Are Failing Us. Under the 20 years of Dr. LeBlanc's direction, SNHU has grown from 2,500 students to over 225,000 learners and is the largest nonprofit provider of online higher education in the country. Dr. LeBlanc immigrated to the United States as a child, was the first person in his extended family to attend college, and is a graduate of Framingham State University, Boston College, and the University of Massachusetts. From 1993 to 1996, he directed a technology startup for Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company, was president of Marlborough College in Vermont from 1996 to 2003, and became president of SNHU in 2003. So welcome, Dr. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Jacob. You guys have to call me Paul. I was afraid that, yeah.
We got the formalities out of the way, so now we can go with
absolutely.
Paul. There are also two Pauls here, so we have to be careful.
Paul W, Paul L.
Who we're addressing.
Yeah, potential confusion.
Yes.
I was wondering if we'd do Paul W and Paul L. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that sounds
luckily,
good.
only one of us has a white beard. No, wait.
Oh yeah. So Paul L, actually, to start, I guess we have a lot of questions, like Paul W said, about from various students and stuff before this even began. But before we even get into those, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit about your education background, like what degrees you pursued and what made you pursue those particular degrees.
Yeah, I mean, as you said in passing, I think immigrant family, youngest of five in my family, immigrated from rural, kind of hardscrabble farming village in Canada, in New Brunswick, kind of French Appalachia, if you will. Acadian family. So if you know Acadians, it's a quirky little subgroup of French Canadians. So we immigrated to the Boston area, and I spoke French before I spoke English, but I was 4, so I didn't speak a lot. But so I learned English, and I always had my nose in a book as a kid. And people describe that. I remember, and my mom cleaned homes for very wealthy families in Weston, Mass, which is still, I think, the highest per capita town in Massachusetts outside of Boston. We lived in a very working class neighborhood in Waltham. And she would bring me, if I wasn't in school, and plunk me into these beautiful libraries. I mean, I still relish the smell of those books and those leather bindings. And there was one in particular, I still remember the name, the Thompsons, and she had a window seat. And they would put me in the window seat and put kids' books in my lap. And I had these memories of her vacuuming, and she always sang, and she was always in the house cleaning, and she'd check in on me. And they're the most warm memories I have, right? So love and care and books and libraries and reading. So, I had 3 teachers who changed my life: Mark Schlafman, Elizabeth Collins, and Helen Heineman, 6th grade, high school, and college. And I think they loved me, and I talk about this all the time about how we have to love our students. And Eileen loved me in the sense that they took the time to really know who I was. They made me feel like I mattered to them. They knew my context. They challenged me. They lifted my sights. They helped me dream bigger dreams for myself. So it was Mr. Schlafman who said to my mother, Paul could go to college someday. We didn't know anybody who went to college. No one in our neighborhood, no one in our extended family. And she held on to that dream. And she worked in a factory till she was in her 70s. She didn't even know how that would happen, right? But she had a kid whose teacher said he could go to college. So I almost had no choice. So I'll have to go faster now. Elizabeth Collins was a high school teacher who helped me think about colleges. And I went to a very affordable state college, Framingham State, outside of Boston. Met my wife. I started at Westville State, and my father had a stroke, and I moved to be closer to home and finished at Framingham. And it was Helen Heineman, who was my undergraduate teacher, who said, "So what do you think about grad school?" When I was an English major, because again, I love literature. And what do you think about grad school? Like, grad school, Dr. Heineman, I'm just lucky to get out of undergrad. What are you talking about? And she's like, absolutely not. Let's talk about this. And it was back in the day. Like, she literally made a phone call to the chair of the department, who was a friend of hers at Boston College, and said, "You need to find a spot for this guy." And he did. And he gave me a teaching assistantship, which was life-changing, because I was in the classroom for the first time. I loved it. I was scarcely older than my students, but it was exhilarating. And when I went to UMass for my doctorate, it was interesting. PCs were just happening. personal computers, and local area networks. And Digital Equipment Corp was the Apple of its day. It was headquartered in Massachusetts. And Ken Olson, who was the storied CEO, was on the board of UMass, and they tried to get into the PC business and failed miserably. They had something. Digital Equipment Corp was often called DEC. They had the DEC Rainbow. That was the name of their PC, and they just donated a ton of them to the university because no one was buying them anyway, and they took the write-off, I think. So the full-time faculty would have nothing to do with them. Like, we're not dealing with this crap. What are these boxes, magic boxes? So they gave it to the graduate assistants and said, you figure it out. And we all taught writing because that's what you do as a TA, as a PhD student. And I started playing with it. I was like, this is pretty great. And then a local area network, and I could do things with my students. I was like, wait a minute, there's no penalty for revision anymore. Like, you don't have to retype a thing, right? You can cut and paste. And so I really shifted into comp ret, so from literature to comp ret, and really with a focus on technology. And I get very interested in this question of what happens when a paradigm shifting technology, which early PCs, pre-web, but even then, like, was changing the world. Like, what happens to the way a society thinks? So I was really interested in the work of Walter Ong, who was a Jesuit priest who wrote about the invention of the printing press and how it changed the noetic economy of Europe and the world. So yeah, so dove into that work, but
wow. So like kind of a lifelong journey of starting from the very beginning, reading, putting your eyes on a book, and then just traveling all of these different pathways. This is something we often talk about in our word for word series, is that there is no straight line specifically from getting from A to B. You didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to be president of SNHU.
Oh God, no.
No. there were
sometimes people will say to me, Jacob, like, did you always want to be a president? Like, what kind of nerdy kid wanted to be a college president? Like, you have to be the worst kid in the world. I wanted to be a cop and a fireman like everybody else in my neighborhood.
Right. So, I mean, it's a journey that it seems like you took the opportunities when they came to you, and it is probably a good message to deliver to all of our attendees tonight as well, as it's something that's, keeping your options open and just exploring where you end up is key. And I think that is kind of resonates with, the whole learning pathways at SNHU as well and everything, which is wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Paul W. or Derek, did you want to take a question, or did you want me to ask another one?
I can chime in. It's interesting when you think about it. I didn't really understand that the importance of the introduction of the PC into your own personal paradigm. But once I heard that, it made me realize that from there, through your work with Houghton Mifflin and at SNHU, kind of exploring how to bring cutting edge technologies to bear in service of our students. And now with AI, it seems that that's a kind of a consistent thread all the way through your career.
Yeah, and I think, the next chapter of my work really post SNHU will be focused on AI in education, because I think it too is a paradigm shifting technology. I think even more powerful than the arrival of the PC, frankly, though you wouldn't have AI without the computing technology that precedes it. But I think this is actually going to much more profoundly reshape society. We could talk about that, I feel like, at some point, but it really is almost a return to my doctoral research, which is, I do think we will be wired differently. I think if you go all the way back to Socrates complaining about this new invention called writing, because he lived in an oral culture. And if you remember, he said things like, well, it's going to make people stupid. Like, they won't memorize anymore. Like, what will they know if they're just reading it and they're going to go back to it? And he complained that, about books, like, look, if you write something stupid, it stays stupid. If we're in dialogue, right? You think about the dialogic, the Socratic method, we get smarter together. But that book, once it's written, if it's dumb, it stays dumb. So, you have the sense. And if you do, if you think about it, where would we rate memorization on the list of cognitive skills that we value? Not even in the top 10, right? We don't memorize anymore. And as soon as the printing press came along, it was impossible to memorize all of the books that existed. So we had to start thinking differently. And that's when we started thinking in terms of taxonomies and classification. Because if I can't remember every book, I need to have some way of remembering where to find the thing I need, right? And Walter Ong, someone said, what's the name of the book? I forget his book, but if you search Walter Ong, you'll find it. But Walter Long argues that you don't have Darwin without the printing press, because Darwin, used classification and taxonomies to start putting animals in categories and genus and species. And so we will change, we'll think of it. I would argue that social media has already changed the cognitive economy of our culture. I think attention spans are shorter with young learners. We're arguably in a post-textual world. Doesn't mean writing will go away or the text will go away, but we are in a video primary world now, a visual primary world. And that's the thing to always remember, when writing became the dominant form of literacy in the world, orality didn't go away. People kept talking, speaking, debate, etc. And even as video and visuals have come to dominate our literacy behaviors, writing hasn't gone away. But I think sometimes when people hear me say, like, well, wait a minute, what do you mean we're in a post-textual world? And if you think about it, when the web was first created, storage and throughput was really hard. So you had very few images and a lot of text. And now if you go to a web page, what do you have? A lot of visuals and a little bit of text. And you click on that text to get more, but the primary communicator now, and of course, TikTok is the best example of this, YouTube. Look how young people and where young people go. It worries me a little bit because I have such a deep love of reading, but it's just interesting to think about how will it change the way we think as a culture.
Yeah, I mean, not, word for word is the production of the creative writing, online creative writing programs here at SNHU. So I take your point completely, but there's still, I mean, it's good to know, right, that there are still a large number of young people and lifelong learners who are coming into our programs who still have that love of the written word and desire to pursue that as a career.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the ability to tell, human beings are wired for narrative, right? They're wired for stories. We live in a world that's obsessed with data, but people aren't moved by data. They're moved by stories. I keep saying to our folks often, they're like, no data, no story without data to support it. But the flip is also true. No data without a story. And we're wired for it. E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard professors would say, actually, we don't think and get our thoughts together and then tell a story. We actually tell a story in order to think. In other words, even as we are sitting here, he would argue, we are all telling a story in our head about what is happening in this moment. So story will always be really important. The way we tell stories, I think, is going to continue to evolve and be different. So if you were a journalist 30 years ago, you wrote. Today, if you're a journalist, you write and you podcast and you do video and you submit, you do photos and you're on Instagram, and your toolkit has to be broader. And I think, depending on the aspirations of our students and how they want to take their skills to market and think about their work, they will, many of them have to think about a broader toolkit, even if the writing is the central tool that they use.
Eric, I'm going to pass it over to you.
So building off of that response, as AI, even the last year, has become more pervasive. We've seen it in our search engines, and when I pull up Facebook, I'm not searching anymore. Meta's asking me what it can do for me, and we have the digital devices at hand on our desk. How do you think we as people maintain a balance between these digital tools in a tactile environment? How do we not get lost in the digital?
Yeah, so my hope for AI is that we will integrate it better into our day-to-day life. My bet is that it's going to be with some form of glasses as our key piece of interface between us, the physical world, and our AI assistant. I think we will all have one. So just 2 days ago, I got my Ray-Ban Metas. So this is the new Meta glasses that look pretty much like regular glasses. They have a camera. and I can look at something and ask Meta. It's big. It's you can't hear it, but it's telling me it's ready to go. So I can look at something and say, no, what is that building? Tell me the history, and it will give me the history. So as I'm walking through the world, I'm engaged, but I now also have this augmentation. So I think augmented reality is a way with a lot of work. So if I'm looking at a problem, rather than if you saw the OpenAI demonstration last week when they announced their new capabilities, they showed someone doing a math problem. They were holding the phone and the system was helping them. Now we'll just look at it and say, hey, right? So imagine if I am gardening and I've got my glasses on and I'm planting like, am I planting? Oh, sorry, my music just started playing because like this is a tap, so like all of a sudden I'm hearing a tower of power on my glasses. So imagine, that I'm wearing my glasses and I can look down and it's like, oh, am I planting these bulbs correctly? I'm a novice gardener, and I can ask the AI, is this how you plant the bulb? And the AI can take a look at that and go, no, 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 you got to turn it over. That part's got to stick down. Thanks. And I keep going. Now, that feels to me like a really healthy way of engaging the technology and not sort of using it to escape the world, but in fact to move through the world differently and more effectively. So I think I mean, we're early, we're very early. So, and then of course we will speak to our computers. The other bet is that we'll be simply dialogic. So you may have seen that Scarlett Johansson is suing OpenAI for, she would argue, mimicking her voice so well. I think she's right, if you played with it yet. But that ability to just talk to your system while you're working. So imagine you're working on a story, and it's set in Germany in 1933, and I could sort of dig out whatever historical, but I literally just without even looking up say, what was the main boulevard that ran through Berlin in 1933, the one that would have led to the Ministry of Defense? And the system will just tell you like, oh, great, thank you. So you're going to have this like research assistant as a writer always at your side. Um, it's going to be interesting to see to what extent people start actually using it to do kind of first drafting based on their prompts. And then the writer's craft may be heightened because you have to look at that. So you have to be good at two things. Can you get really, really good at the kind of prompts that give you better content? And then are you a good enough writer and reader of your own writing to look at that and say, oh, not good enough, and then start making it your own? So the craft is going to change for sure.
It almost makes me wonder. I mean, writing is so profoundly linked to the action of doing stuff with your hands and your fingers. Drawing, I mean, all this stuff is tactile, like Derek said. And now we're moving into a space, as you said, where there might be, for example, just as in the past, certain, writers that were blind, for example, would dictate their works. Maybe that is an avenue that will become more popular now in terms of composition, but that seems to engage different avenues in your brain, right? To speak as opposed to writing, the actual process of having words kind of pour through your fingers onto the page somehow. It's I can see why some writers are a little nervous about it.
Yeah, well, was it one of the Roman rhetoricians who counseled his students to write on clay tablets so that they could revise, like don't chip away at a stone because then it's literally set in stone, right? Um, all of our technology tools, our literacy tools, do change the way we work and change the way we produce. So um, I'm going to guess that most of our students are using a keyboard and not writing with a pen and paper. And if you do that, you pay a much less hefty price of revision. Revision is just easier because I don't have to retype. I can literally cut and paste. I can move things. Oh, geez, I wrote this whole thing and I buried the lead. I got to move this to the beginning of this, right? That's easy and fast. So your production became different. In 2022, started thinking, I'm going to write letters again. So I write long letters to people and put them in the mail. It gets such a response, right? So my first ones were to my two daughters and then family members, etc. but I find that I compose differently. If I'm at the keyboard, I blast things out. I'm fast. I'm working with my pen. I'm a lot slower. It's like, oh shit, I gotta cross this out and start again because I don't like the way this all looks in the letter anymore, right? So um, I don't know what that means for, to your point, Paul, the way we might simply dictate. I'm not good at that. I write to think. So I labor to get to the thinking, and then I have to edit pretty dramatically because it's usually I finally get to my discovery at the end, which is not where you usually want the main point, right? So it's going to be an interesting thing. Someone in your chat said, isn't if you use AI, so it's kind of like plagiarism, and I think we're going to have to rethink these questions. Like these notions of plagiarism and originality are themselves complex questions. When I leave SNHU on June 30th, I hand over the keys to Lisa Ryerson, my successor. I'll then be leading a new company called Human Systems, which is focused on AI and education. And it's just a little group of, I think, 7 full-time people. But the most recent hire that just agreed to join us is a philosopher. We've got engineers and technicians. We got 30 contractors, who can do code and and write and do large language models. But we need a philosopher in this mix because we're going to be raising really interesting ethical questions and philosophical questions and questions like what is originality? Now, it's tempting to say, no, none of our students should use AI in their work. I could also argue those are the very tools that are going to make them more productive and get them jobs. Like if you aren't proficient in the use of AI tools and you apply for a job, I mean, I just saw the stats today. It's like 70% of employers said they would not hire a candidate today who doesn't understand how to use AI in the job. So I do think we're going to have, I think every department, every dean, every department chair now has to look at their curricula and say, what changes? What are the tools that my graduates will be expected to use? What will be the tools that will make my graduates more powerful? I'll choose from a different field and go back to my glasses analogy. It takes about 10 years to train a doctor and well over $1 million and more, $2 million, right? It's a long time. And we don't train enough of them. There are not enough doctors in America right now. There are whole parts of society that don't have access to a good doctor. And even if you have privilege, if you have a good medical plan like SNHUs, you still have to wait quite often to see a doctor. David Autor, the labor economist at MIT, imagines a future where we will use AI to do all of that expert knowledge that the doctor has. Because if you think about what your doctor's trained to do, it's high expertise in prediction. So Jacob comes in to see me, and my job is really to reckon, as Chris Dede at Harvard says, to really listen to his symptoms, how he's presenting, start to make some predictions about what this is likely to be, order the right test to weed things out, kind of narrow in, then talk about that, really nail it down. And when I'm sure, then my next thing is to reckon the best course of treatments and make predictions about what's going to work for him. Well, he's a young guy, he's pretty fit, da da da. Maybe this treatment's a little harsh, but he can stand up to because he's healthy and fit, right? And it's all reckoning. It's incredibly expensive to do. We could now equip nurses who are much faster to train, et cetera. Imagine they have those glasses. Imagine that they're now sitting with the patient. They have all the foundational skills. They know how to take tests. They know how to put a PICC line in your arm. They often have better human skills than doctors do. And now they can basically work with the AI to have incredible, like better than the best trained doctor, right? The best trained doctor has practiced for 40 years and has seen 20,000 patients, right? That's what they're trained on. They're trained on 20,000 patients with all their biases and limitations that one life can have. AI is trained on millions and millions of patients and hundreds of thousands of doctors, right? And there's growing evidence now that when you put a human in the loop in medicine, it actually produces worse results. So it's tempting to say, well, okay, they can use AI, but I want my doctor to look at it. It might actually give you worse results if you do that. So that's one profession, nursing, that's going to really be different. What happens when we talk about writers and writing? So it's going to be a fun ride.
Well, I kind of like what you said earlier. I mean, I thought it was a good example where you were talking about, if you're writing something about the 30s Germany and you need to know the name of the boulevard that's leading to a specific place and stuff, and that AI can help you with that. And that kind of it aligns well with the idea that AI is a tool that you use rather than the thing itself that creates the content or makes it creative. Like the human behind that question is still the one that's asking it, that then can add it or fold it into their own personal writing. So I see a lot of notes and comments in the chats about people being very nervous about AI and it taking over creative writing and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of folks kind of think like, you know, there are going to be people out there who are going to say, write the next Stephen King novel, except that I write it, right? And that's going to be like how AI is going to be handled and used. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it probably won't be that way because it'll be messy. It'll be, people are going to be able to tell it's a hack Stephen King novel that someone wrote using AI, as opposed to, again, like the example that you use, where it's like, I need this example. It's off the top of my head. This is going to save me time. It's not going to take me 10 years to write this novel now. It's only going to take me 2 years to write the novel. You know, there are some nice benefits to that. And I think that kind of goes back to a couple of questions that we've also had too. One way earlier about like what inspired you to start writing books in the first place. You have these two nonfiction books, and you mentioned that you are a prolific reader. I know that we get our emails and stuff weekly, and you'll share what you're reading and stuff for the week. So like, I guess, what inspired you to start with nonfiction? Are you interested in ever writing fiction? And are there any particular authors or anything that really kind of drove you to do this?
Yeah. So, the pandemic, obviously, we were all sort of hunkered down and wasn't traveling at all. So I had time for a change, weekends. And while it was incredibly busy, I mean, those first 2 years, there was no playbook for anyone leading an institution at the time. And it was incredibly exhausting, but it was exhilarating in its own way from a leadership perspective. But I had been, presenting and talking and writing short form. I did a series for EDUCAUSE Review that won a magazine article award for, I think it was 5 columns on innovation. I write a lot on my blog, and I write to think, so I love to write, and always have. I paid my way through part of college as a journalist. I was a stringer for a newspaper, and so I love storytelling, and I love to write. So what I found during the pandemic is that I find that a little bit of breathing space to start to pull together a lot of the things I cared about in terms of higher ed and rethinking the system. So the first book, which was Students First, is really a book about system change, rethinking the system of higher education, finding, for example, that tying students to time is a kind of structural inequity for low-income students because they have less time and less control over time. So when you build a whole education model on time, you inherently disadvantage some people, right? And so that was the first book. But in the middle of that book, I got stuck, and I'm usually a pretty fast writer. And I was talking to, a little circle of readers that I sort of send things to, and one of them said to me, "Well, why are you stuck? Like, what are you struggling with?" And I said, I'm stuck on a question that I posed to my wife when I came down from looking at a blank page screen for a while. And the question was, can higher education learn to love its students again? And I told this to this reader who said, why do you take a break and just try to answer that question? So I started writing, and I wrote like a fiend, like furiously. I would write from 5 in the morning till 7 at night, nonstop for lunch. My wife would bring me a cup of tea and a power bar for lunch. One of those when you get in that flow, and I was just producing a lot of words. And I ended up writing sort of 6 chapters that later became the basis for the book Broken. And when I finished it, I actually got back to the first book and could write again. Like I had to unblock, like that was taking up my psychic space. Now the reality is when the first book was done, I was like, well, let me go see if there's anything of value in that. And honestly, not a lot of it made it into Broken, but it was kind of the foundation and then I wrote Broken. And that book was, just a delightful exercise for a year of talking to really smart people about how do we fix our social systems of care? So K-12, higher ed, healthcare, addiction treatment. These are all systems that are meant to lift people up in some way or another. And yet in America, they so often dehumanize the very people they are meant to serve. They often dehumanize the people who work in those systems as well. Think about burned out teachers or nurses, callous, social workers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I sort of came to write those two books. Now, to go to your question about fiction, I fantasize about it. I think it's a higher order skill than writing nonfiction. I like to think I'm a reasonable storyteller. I think most people who, I don't know if you guys are the experts, not me, but I think about, I was an English major for a long time. A lot of people's first novels are based on their life. There are a lot of coming of age novels because that's what people want to kind of process and unpack and think about. So I think of D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, his first novel, which is a book I actually love very much. Though D.H. Lawrence is so far out of fashion that most people forget who he is. But, the Bildungsroman, as the term is used, right? That coming of age youth novel. And then the other one is To Write About a World You Know, and mine is higher ed. And I'm so intimidated because I think Richard Russo wrote probably the single best higher ed book ever called The Straight Man, which was made recently into a TV series, which was okay. But if you've read the book, it's just
Amazing.
terrific.
Hilarious.
Yeah, higher ed, is a quirky. We live in a quirky and work in a quirky industry, so it has no end of entertaining characters and possibilities. I imagine, characters murdering other characters for their tenure spot and all kinds of good stuff you could do with it. But I don't know, we'll see. Right now, actually, what the board has asked me to do with some of my time, because I'll move into this kind of emeritus status, is to write a book that reflects back on the last 21 years to say, what is that story? And I didn't want to write like a coffee table history where you only tell all the funny and great stories about how great you are and how great the place is. What I said is I was willing to do it if I could talk about our stumbles and the things we got wrong and the lessons we learned. And I tried to do that in Broken. And interestingly, one of the things I heard a lot from in terms of our response to Broken is people really liked my willingness to talk about the times I failed as a leader or struggled or I got it wrong. Because it's not written as a leadership book or even as a memoir, but that's in there as well because I'm in that story. But very rarely do they want to tell you all the sort of great insights they have. Rarely do they say, hey, look, I want to tell you, because I don't know but I've learned more from my stumbles than I have from my wins.
Right. And I think, I just think reading a novel where someone's winning all the time just doesn't feel very interesting to me. It's
No,
you
no, it's
you
not.
gotta see them struggle. Conflict is the number one thing that you need in writing and stuff. So
Yeah, I'm
well,
pretty
thank
sure
you.
Joseph Campbell did not have an archetype that was like the hero who gets it right all the time. It's like the least
Right.
interesting story ever.
Right. He gets to the threshold and says, I'm good.
Yeah, yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
So
Well,
I
thank
mean,
you.
yeah.
Yeah. Derek, did you have another question in mind?
Yeah, I think there's one that we have from the pre-collected questions. Actually, I think kind of segues out of this fairly nicely. So thinking about the challenges of writing a creative story and capturing the complexity of the human experience. We don't want to read about just the wins, the failures, the falls. So how do you envision the integration of AI and other emerging technologies shaping the future of liberal arts education and writing at SNHU and beyond that? I know you touched like the specific example of researching, but on a larger scale, how does that work that's very much connected to the human experience, whether it be art, imagery, writing? On the big picture scale, how is that going to change, do you think?
So I've talked about this a lot kind of on the sort of stage these days at lots of conferences. I'm speaking at NVIDIA actually in 2 weeks, which is the big, AI chip maker. And I would say is that I think education is going to be a lot less about epistemology, about knowing what do you know, how do you know, what counts for what you know, and more about ontology, about being. And if that's right, if that's true, because in terms of knowing, I now have a device, like we are going to be no longer the most powerful entities on the planet in terms of lots of domains of knowledge. If you can get your mind wrapped around that, like already AI will outperform a doctor. Already, if you follow, there's an amazing article in Science Magazine about protein folding, and teams of PhD, doctorate qualified medical researchers will spend years, a decade longer, trying to do one of these structures, which are the basic building blocks of life. DeepMind did them in a year, all of them. It's an amazing story because it unlocks unbelievable possibilities in terms of life sciences. One of the skeptical doctors said, I didn't think in my lifetime I would see this. And in 1 year, DeepMind did all of it. So we have these amazing knowledge tools available to us. But here's the thing. If I'm right about moving from epistemology to ontology, which are really questions about being, how are you in the world? What does it mean to be a good human? How do you understand and navigate the world of others, etc.? That's the realm of the humanities. That's what literature does. That's what stories do. When I was a kid reading in those libraries, I was traveling the world without ever leaving that room. And I was learning. I think just because we do a lot of these very psychometric tests, et cetera, et cetera. My highest score is on empathy. And I think it comes from being a reader and being a literature major because it forces you to live in the skin of people. When I read Anna Karenina, I know what it means to be a woman in 18th century Russia. Um, and and it's an astounding story, right? I'm transported. If you're not a reader, you only lead one life, the one you're in. But if you're a reader, you lead, you sample many lives. And I think my hope is that actually a lot of the knowledge jobs that have a lot of status right now and get paid a lot are going to go away. And I actually think that's probably a good thing. As the famous computer scientist Stuart Russell at Berkeley says, if you had told our ancestors 3, 4, 500 years ago, imagine this amazing future where you spend all day in a box. It's called an office building, but it's basically a big box. And when you go into the big box, you get a little glass box called a cubicle. And then in that little glass box, you spend the day staring at a little lit up box called a computer screen. They would have run the other way, think this sounds like a vision of hell. But that's what a lot of the knowledge economy looks like. If you or my daughter just graduated from law school 2 days ago, and some of her colleagues are going to big law, big corporate law, you know what they're going to do all day? Go to a big box, sit in a small box, and look at a little lit up box. Um, and and what if instead we could move over to the questions of the really existential questions we identify with the humanities and talk about what does it mean? I'll give you the example from Chris Dede, who I mentioned at Harvard before. If you imagine now that nurses have all this power and this ability, right? And it's not, the work of medicine is no longer about getting the right treatment, the right diagnosis, the right treatment. What happens then is your caregiver does something much more important. They say, God forbid, Derek, but I'll use it as an example. Derek, I know this is a devastating diagnosis we've just come upon. Talk to me about the conversation you're going to have tonight when you get home with your family. Talk to me about your community. Talk to me about your support system. How do you think about quality of life? We're going to have some pretty tough decisions in front of us. How do you want to make those decisions, Derek? Who's going to be in your circle? How can I help you? Right? Those are really human. AI can't do that. AI is not going to give you that. So I argue in Broken that my hope is that as knowledge jobs get obliterated, and I think a lot of them will, we're actually going to move over to, we could flood our K-12 system with amazing teachers, social workers, coaches, right, support staff. We could rebuild a mental health system that is completely decimated in America. And we could flood it with great clinicians and social workers and psychologists and rebuild. We use prisons now in America as our mental health care system. We could build a compassionate, caring, affordable system of geriatric care for an aging society. Anybody on this call right now, on this podcast who has an aging parent and is struggling to navigate that system knows how hard it is. We could have national daycare, right? So women especially are not penalized for having children, and families are not penalized for having children. Like all of that could be done. None of those jobs get done by AI. The problem in a knowledge economy, those jobs aren't valued. They're not paid well. We don't like to pay for them. But in a world where knowledge work is now being done by much more capable AI systems, maybe that is an invitation to get back to jobs that actually make us feel better about ourselves, that actually improve the lives of others, that actually improve our communities. And we will have to rework our whole workforce economy and how things get paid for. But that's what happens when you go through a paradigm shifting shift like the one we're in. I'm a big fan of a labor economist, and excuse me, she's not she's an economist named Carlota Perez. And Carlota Perez, she's Venezuelan and British. She has a great book. I'm going to hold it up so because I know people are saying, "What are the titles?" It's a little geeky, but it's not a long read. This is the book. It's called Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital. I know that does not sound like the typical book we would do in a creative writing program, but she's really good about talking about when a shift like this happens, you go into a very messy period where everything gets reordered. The things that used to be winning are losing, the losers become winners. Things you didn't think were possible become possible. Whole new worlds spring up. So if you think about industrial revolution and technology, steam, electricity, that bundle of things, think about what happens. The landed aristocracy gives way to capitalist. Capitalism gets created for good or bad. Cities explode in size, right? It's the big, right? All of a sudden, all this new infrastructure takes place because we have supply chains. Now all of a sudden you have global trade because you have to feed those factories. Like the whole world changed, and things became, and the middle class was invented, right? Now you have a merchant class that just again explodes in size. We're in from one of those periods. And I don't want to make people on this call to feel like, he's giving me a headache and agita here. But yeah, it's going to be messy. It's, what she would say to you is that when you're in these periods, governments fall, wars happen, revolutions occur, because the reinvention is hard. you know, if you think about my example of doctors and nurses, do you think the American Medical Association is not going to go down with a fight? We're going to see this huge backlash against AI. The writers' strike in Hollywood was in part a reaction against AI. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who's the co-founder of DreamWorks, when he saw Sora, which is the voice-to-video technology from OpenAI, his comment was something like 90% of the world's animators just got a pink slip. They don't know it yet. Now, that's terrible if you're one of those folks. But you've just put that technology in the hands of millions of people and democratized the ability now to do film. And for a while, we're going to see crap. I mean, it's going to remember when word processing came along and everybody's Aunt Mabel did a newsletter for the family and they were just terrible. Like they were graphically terrible. Everything was terrible about them. But we also then started to see with word processing, like we empowered people. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. I can lose sleep just as easily as you about all the ways this could go wrong. Yes, as someone said, I've seen Terminator, like that's the nightmare dream. But I do think that a world in which we can get pulled back into human work and we ask the question, how do we be better humans, is probably not a bad question right now because we ain't doing that well. Like if you're worried about AI screwing up systems of society, which one's working well? Put your like just throw it out there. Which system do you think is working really well? I've argued that higher ed's largely broken. I like to think that SNHU is trying to reinvent and make it better. I think that healthcare is broken. I think government's broken. Like maybe human intelligence isn't all that great after all, but AI will not replicate the human heart. And it won't replicate judgment and wisdom the way Chris Dede talks about. And actually, I think it's a much higher order skill to have that conversation. Derek, tell me about how we're going to get through this, than it is to figure out what disease you have. That's just knowledge work. I want human work. And I think we'd all feel better about ourselves. Look at young people right now are chronically lonely. 72% of them say they're extremely lonely, defined as I don't have anyone I can turn to. We've never seen that before. The highest has always been the elderly at about 40%, and that has stayed pretty constant. 25% of teenage girls in America have said they've planned their suicide in the last 12 months, and 13% of those have tried it. Like, it's like our young people are suffering. I think a world that gets them reconnected to community. Like Stuart Russell actually envisions, he raises an interesting question. I was on a panel today with somebody from MIT having this discussion. We're both in the camps like, there's a version of the world where AI allows us not to work, which is a weird thing because I argue that humans need purpose. But what if you could work on the thing that you love? So what if people could write? What if they could paint? What if they could do poetry? What if they could create amazing gardens? What if they could create fashion, sew, music, right? That feels pretty compelling. Those are all associated with the humanities, the creative arts. Like I, I, I actually have argued in various settings that AI will revitalize the humanities, but not in their current form. I think the humanities and the liberal arts are pretty sclerotic in the way that they are structured, and they need to be reinvented for the time in which we find ourselves.
Let me kind of segue from that, because I think that there's kind of one force or movement or direction that you are articulating very well in relation to the possibilities that are opened up with AI. But then, as you also pointed out, if you kind of look at the systems around us, look at the world around us, there are forces that are moving in the opposite direction. And I want to put that in the context of, say, the George Floyd murder, Black Lives Matter, when afterwards there seemed to be a genuine effort in establishing, looking at, institutional racism, white supremacy, the incorporation of principles of DEI into a lot of institutions, such as this one, I'm proud to say. But now we're seeing pushback against that in where some states have outlawed the discussion of history. Racism can't be mentioned. Libraries are being attacked and shut down. I've been reading a book recently called it's about the coded gaze by a scholar named Joy Buluwimi. And she points out the ways, I'm sure you know all about this. So as we bring AI on board, how are we able to, number one, work against those kind of regressive forces in society that seem to be gaining the upper hand and keep from slipping back when AI itself is kind of incorporating some of that same power structure just because it's more or less inherited?
Yeah, so I think what's heartening to me about AI that we did not see with social media, I think social media took a terrible toll on our society, especially on our young people. And we're paying a very high price for it. A lot of the mental health stuff I cited, I think, is tied to social media. But we had no smart policy discussion about it when it was created. We just thought, this is cool. Like, we're going to connect everyone and everyone's going to talk to more people so we won't be in our little echo chambers. And it went absolutely the opposite way. We're more connected, never more lonely. We're in these echo chambers. And of course, all of that technology got used to drive disinformation and a lot of the political strife we see in our country right now. I think it's exacerbated by failure of K-12 education, underfunded, undersupported. So we don't do critical thinking in any real way. We don't do literacy training for kids. We don't do civics education very much anymore, et cetera, et cetera. We can unpack this at length. AI gets trained. So how we train it, there's a lot of discussion right now about how we train it, algorithmic bias, cultural hegemonic bias. Part of my team has worked on a global data consortium for higher ed, and one of the things we've done is work to bring in university partners from other cultures, the global south. So I was in Rwanda meeting with the Minister of Education and the Prime Minister about how do we get Rwanda into this mix, because if we train only on white North American and European models, we are going to get, guess what, a very sort of, a deep reflection of where we are at time. Remember, ChatGPT was trained on Reddit, and was trained on some white national, like it's all there, right? I mean, it's essentially kind of repeating, humans and all their messiness and flaws. What's going on in all the things you recited. we could spend hours unpacking how we got here. But I think in the end, I do believe that a lot of the folks who feel who feel most disenchanted, who are Trump supporters, I mean, I'll make my own biases clear here. I'm political progressive. I think they have been made to feel like they don't matter in the world any longer. And what we learned from Frantz Fanon, his book, The Wretched of the Earth, is one of my top 10 most influential books for my intellectual development, if you know his work. But, Richard Wright, if you want to go to a novel like Native Son, Camus and The Stranger, is that the greatest need for a human being, our existentially deepest need, is to matter. And if you are told all the time you no longer matter, you will make yourself known. You will strike out. You will assert, and you often assert in violence. And I think a lot of what we see in the MAGA world are in a technological, globally connected world in which to not have a college degree is to be lesser than, and to live in towns that were hollowed out by NAFTA and global trade, which were a net good for the world, but really bad for these towns. They feel like they don't matter anymore. So I think this sense of like, make America great again and blaming the other is the oldest playbook of fascism, and every fascist authoritarian has used it. So that's the immigration piece of that. But I think, as a lifelong Democrat, I blame Bill Clinton is culpable in this mix. There was a time when the Democratic Party was the party of working people like my family, blue collar people, unions, and we lost our way on that. And I think we're paying a price for it now. So the intellectual, educated elites of the East Coast and the West Coast, there's a reason that the map looks the way it does. And we've got to sort of get this right. We have to give I think a vision. Jessica Benjamin, who's a wonderful psychologist at NYU, I spent a lot of time interviewing her for my book, talks about a state of thirdness. And it's the notion that we come together even when we disagree. The way we get through that is to find a third state that we can work towards together. And right now, forever, I know it sounds a little hokey, but when I was growing up, it's like no matter who you were, there was a sense of, but we're Americans, like we're all Americans, even if I look different than you, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, that was not a recognition extended to people of color, for example. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. But now you've got basically two camps in the US that think the other person's not an American. Like you're not really an American, you're a threat to America. And both sides say it. We've stopped talking about this. So we've got to figure out how to change the conversation and be engaged in the conversation again with people who look and disagree. There's a guy by the Milliard when I was leaving today, and he was out there with a huge Trump sign at the intersection. He's often out there at like 5 o'clock when people are, commuting. So he's out there with the signs. It's cooler, and he's dedicated to Trump, right? And if I had more time, I would have pulled over and just gone over to talk to him and just say, walk me through your thinking, like not aggressively, like no, just like I want to understand, like what are you seeing? Like we got to be back in the conversation. And I'm guilty of writing off too many people. I don't want to live in a world where I dislike half the people in the country.
Yeah. I mean, I like that you mentioned, mattering, feeling like you matter. That's something that you bring up in your book, Broken. Right there.
Yeah.
And I think it's such an important quality of the liberal arts education is imbuing people with the ability to appreciate that other people matter. Empathy, I guess, might be another word for it.
Empathy, mattering actually is a concept defined in the book by Greg Elliott, sociologist at Brown, is three things. That means I have a sense that you see me, that you recognize me, right? I'm seen. The second is that you invest in me. So it could be you've given me your time or your attention. If it's an employee, like you've development, like you are paying attention, helping me develop as an employee, staff person, etc. But there's a third, which is my presence helps shape the world we are in together. So again, if it's an employee, it's like, hey, it's really nice that you feel like you know me, and it's great that you're sending me to conferences. But if my input never reshapes the organization, if I think there are things we could do better and I never see that heard and listened to, I don't really feel like I matter anymore. So it's actually a little bit more complicated. It's different than belonging. Like we all belong to things that don't make us feel like we matter to them. I write a check to various associations. I like their journal. It's important for me to go to their conference, but I don't think I matter to them. They don't make me feel like I matter per se. Mattering is a whole nother level of human connection. You know whose mental health did not dissipate one bit during the pandemic? There's one group in America that like just was thrived and didn't have any impact. The Amish.
Huh.
Why? Connected, faith-based, strong sense of community, right? Like all these things. And what we know right now from a mental health perspective is that we cultures are doing much better than me cultures. And
Yeah.
America is a deeply, deeply seated me culture, right? Rugged individualism. We weren't always that way. I think this is sort of, post-Reagan, the American cowboy became this sort of iconic figure. But the reality is, there was a time when everyone took pride in their public school, when a town would take pride in its public school, like everyone would send their kids there. Uh, um, there's just a whole bunch of things that were communal, where we all could come together to say, let's rebuild Europe after World War II. Let's build the interstate highway system. When John Kennedy gets up and says, we're going to send a man to the moon within 10 years. They didn't know how to do it. Like they didn't know if they could do it. But the nation rallied around that, right? And it was tied into global politics and the Cold War, and Sputnik scared the hell out of us. So we invested in science. But the whole nation, stayed up late to watch Neil Armstrong step on the moon. When was the last time America did something, like built something truly great that we all rallied behind? We couldn't even build a friggin' tunnel from New Jersey to New York because Chris Christie wouldn't do it politically, right? I mean, we're talking like it's been a long time, and I think it saddens the world that for all of our clumsiness and the things that we would do and get wrong. But I was talking to a good friend who's an eminent astrophysicist at Oxford. But he studied and worked in the US for a long time. He said, we all wanted to come to America in the 1960s and 70s. It was the place where you guys dreamed bigger. There was this cocky American sense that we kind of resented, but secretly loved, which is you just thought you could do anything. Put a man on the moon? Yeah, we'll do that. We kind of lost that swagger. And I think a lot of it was tied to this question of our common good. And I think the common good has been lost.
Yeah. And how do you get it back? That's
Story.
the question.
You want to talk about it's the power of narrative. It's the power of story. I think Barack Obama was our last really great political storyteller. And he could tell the story of America, right? There's no red America, there's no blue America, there's one America. You could tell the story of hope. Now, as a set of politics, poetry meets prose when you start to govern. You run on poetry, you govern in prose. Sorry for all your prose writers, but the point here is that the big story, the story that inspires people, that makes your heart full, is so powerful. And I think we're waiting for leaders who, once again, can tell stories, a vision of our future. And I think that common people are hungry for it. We have to be careful not to believe that the political battles are the personal battles in the communities in which we live. Todd Rose does really great work on this. He says, like, the reality is if you really put the headlines away, stop watching the news for a bit, and look at the kinds of polling his organization does. I think it's called Prosper. 82% of Americans believe in sensible gun control. Like that's not the fight. Like we want that. Now our politicians won't. They'll have fears. They'll do everything they do. But like on issue after issue, we are more united as a country than our political leadership and our fractured politics would lead us to believe. And I think right now, what's happening is people are scared. And when people are scared, it doesn't bring out the best in human beings. So if
Yeah.
I want you to hate Joe Biden, I'm going to tell you that scary immigrants are storming across our border and murdering. You know what's true about immigrants? Every community that has more immigrants is safer. Just factual. There's less crime in immigrant-dominant communities. They don't take the chance, right? They don't get arrested and get sent back. You would never believe that if you listen to Fox News. But they want to whip up fear. That's what we do. Sorry. I'm getting preachy. I'll stop.
I think
Um,
I've discovered that if you turn off the news and just stop listening for a while, you see a whole different view of America that is right in front of you, but it's buried a lot of the time because there is that infighting and stuff. So I always like to recommend to people just turn away from the news for a little bit. It'll still be there if you ever want to go back. It's not going anywhere. But if you
Yeah,
if
I
you
think one of the
do,
nicest things to do is travel, just drive, like travel through
drive.
America.
Yep.
And look at there are parts of America that scare me a little bit, like, holy shit, this is really a red state. Like, where am I, right? But then you get up and talk to people and ask for help or directions, or you find out that there's just a lot of stuff that we have in common.
Yep. This hour went by incredibly fast.
Oh, geez, and we're already at the end of the hour. I'm so sorry.
Oh no,
Talking too
not
long.
at all. No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for this, Paul. It's been delightful, and yeah, I know that all of us here have been at SNHU for a while. I mean, you've been here the longest, of course, but you know, it's been a privilege working with you over the years and stuff, and we look forward to seeing um, what you come up with next and stuff with this. Actually, there were two questions from the chat that I wanted to ask before we ended. One was, can you name that book again that you held up? Because there were some
sure.
folks who wanted to know the name of that book.
So Carlotta, it's Carlota, Perez, Perez,
Okay.
and it's called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. Technological
Okay.
Revolutions and Financial Capital. And the first section is the one that's kind of a look back at history and how other technological revolutions impacted us. So it gives you a framework for thinking about this. It's really quite good.
Great. Okay. That's good.
Yeah,
And the second question was, what was your business name? Because people wanted to follow you after this too. Like that.
Oh,
that
it's very funny actually.
Yeah.
It's called Human Systems. You can go to humansystems.com and find the least informative webpage in the history of the internet. It's just a placeholder. So we're being a bit coy right now still about what we're building, but I will tell you that it integrates wellness and well-being. Students who are willing to let us connect to their Apple Watches or their Fitbits, we can build that into the learning. There's soft skills development. It's pretty exciting, and it's really built to try to get people out into their community with their learning. So what the team agreed is, like, if we're incredibly successful and we have 1 million people sitting in darkened bedrooms thinking that they're talking to a human being, we should pull the plug on this right now. Like, that's not what we're trying to build. So again, humansystems.com, someone's asking about it. But look thank you. I have to run. I have another meeting because our team's in Australia, so it's morning there. So we have these late night meetings. But I do want to thank you guys for the work with our program. I feel like I'm in these meetings right now, and they are in part a series of goodbyes for me as I wind down. And I always want to say thank you. It's been such an honor to be your president for these students. We did our last commencement a couple of weeks ago, and it was so emotionally moving. Our students are the best thing that in my profession. Graduation is my Christmas, my birthday, and my New Year's all rolled up into one. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight. I'm going to stop now because I'll get teary. It's been a lovely 21 years at an amazing place with amazing students and amazing faculty and staff. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, guys. Be well.
All right.
Okay. Bye.
Take care.
And before we sign off, I just want to let everyone know that our next Word for Word will be on June 26th. It's our last event of the season. And it will be the Graduate Spotlight, in which we honor 6 recent graduates of the BA, MA, and MFA online creative writing programs. I hope you will join us for that. It's always a fun time. And thanks to the recently and yet still to be departed Dr. Paul LeBlanc.
Still very busy too.
Yes, obviously.
Meeting in Australia after this. So, but yes, it was a pleasure, and thank you all for coming. Please do come for the next one on June 26th. Keep an eye out for that. You'll see it in your emails. You'll see it in your classrooms, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, Derek, for joining us tonight as well. And yeah, have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.